Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are. You're listening to myself and Quaid. This is the Currency of Discourse podcast, and we're recording this one on the eve of Memorial Day, and so we thought we might give maybe, I don't know if it's going to turn out patriotic or not, but a patriotic, seemingly themed idea. And what we want to talk about today is one of the American myths, or what I perceive growing up to have been a American myth, because we have many myths about our country. And so starting off, what is a myth? A myth is, one definition might be something to the effect of, a traditional story that a group of people or a nation tells about itself to build an identity and instill certain values within its culture to build what they want their people to be like, and values to express. And if I could boil down into a simple phrase what one American myth is, that I think I learned growing up, and that a lot of people learned growing up, was that just boiling it down is we're the good guys. And that idea, I think, comes from, maybe starts in, the Civil War period, where the northern states were fighting for not only the preservation of the Union, but the freedom of a certain race of people from slavery. And then moving forward in time, this idea that Americans fight for freedom and justice of individuals was solidified after World War II in freeing Europe, playing a role in the freeing of Europe and the East from countries like Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And I thought it would be interesting to explore this idea of the American myth and how this perception of we're the good guys has changed over time, because that's the myth that I grew up with. And I'm not sure that myth is no longer believed by a significant portion of the population. And I'd like to get us to a place where we figure out how to actualize that myth. I think that myth, if it is believed by, or if it's a story that we're all aware of, I think it's worth trying to get us back to a point where that myth is believable or true, because I think it has the connotation of that myth being true or close to true results in a certain type of character for the American population that I think would be good for us as a country overall. So I think that that's the conversation that we're going to have today, and I'm interested, Quaid, to hear what you have about these ideas and see where it goes from there, because we haven't really talked about this yet.
No, I know that you were asking me before this if it's something I felt like I grew up with. And it wasn't. I know a lot of people do grow up with that idea. But I just kind of grew up in a home where not a lot was taught. So it wasn't like there was pushback against the idea. It was just my unique upbringing. I think a lot of people do get brought up to think that that's true. I think probably in my teen years, I started to believe some of that, especially with 9/11. Mm-hmm. It was like a big kind of event that made me start to think about politics and whatnot. And I generally aligned myself with Republicans at the time, so I did buy into that narrative that we were the greatest and that we were going to go on this voyage. I for a brief time there thought the Iraq War was a good thing, generally speaking. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so I know what it's like to believe that too, and then why eventually I stopped believing it. And it was also in part because of that war. It was because eventually I became convinced that I was swallowing things that weren't true, and that was one of those like, oh, I bought into the myth, this myth that doesn't seem to be accurate in many ways. There seems to be a lot of things wrong, and a lot of people did too, though they didn't necessarily buy into the myth. Like Christopher Hitchens was for the war. I don't think he necessarily bought into the idea that America's, a force for good. As of right now, though, I don't know. I don't know what I think. As always, and I've always thought this, and I've said this before, that I think that America has a lot of potential, and I'm not so postmodernist that I think that all perspectives are equal, or that really in any situation there's not a good or bad guy. I don't believe that. It's really hard for me to buy that. And so I don't think that we are necessarily the good guys. I think we could be. But I think two things that I'd want to do. One is I want to say that it might be difficult to do. And I also want to represent the position that some people are going to say that it would be impossible given the power dynamics that really...
Impossible to return to actualizing that myth? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, or that it's even possible for any nation to do it, because you have to give certain institutions so much power that it's always going to incentivize the worst. That really there is no pure or even close to pure form of allocating power to do that. In order for America to be kind of like the superhero that goes around the world. A lot of liberals push back against that idea. They don't want us going anywhere ever. They think we should always just worry about ourselves and be insular. And the reason that they think that is because essentially, like, I think the notion is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? You think you have the best intentions, because you have to view yourself positively. You can't not do that. It would be very difficult for you to live life if you always thought you were a piece of shit. So you kind of...
I think that's one of the problems of the left, is that they view our country as this corrupt thing, rather than you spoke about potentiality. Like, America has potential to do amazing things, and has done amazing things in the past, and it's got a dark history as well. But I think the focus, particularly on the left, is of the dark history and the dark elements of the United States, which is useful for bringing light to that darkness and self-criticism.
Yeah.
But I think when it becomes all-encompassing, and there's this, like, I get a feeling of self-hatred almost, or this heavy guilt that I don't think is useful for people to put on their own shoulders. And
well, I know that you dabble in people who are proponents of nationalism, and they're going to be the people opposed to that. Liberals are going to be the people that are opposed to that narrative of nationalism. And I ultimately want to transcend nationalism. I don't think... that's just me personally. My personal opinion is I do believe in unification, so on and so forth. I think nationalism is something that could be useful to us in terms, because again, I also don't buy the narrative that there is no good guy. I can actually bring up, I think it'll be relevant here, the idea of Game of Thrones. So just so everybody out there is aware, spoiler alerts, because I am going to kind of talk a little bit about it, because I think it's relevant. Because, or do you not want me to talk about it?
Go for it, man.
Okay.
I don't know much about it, so
Okay.
this you're in charge. But
yeah, so they have this. It's actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it's a perfect setup. It's a perfect setup to have the conversation, because you have Khaleesi, or Daenerys Targaryen. She's one of the people fighting for the throne, and she sees her position as kind of the the doer of good deeds. She sees herself as a force for good in the world. And so she has 3 dragons, she has this huge army, and she basically uses it to take over absolutely everything. And along the way, she does things like she frees slavers. There's a place called Slaver's Bay. And in the show, she basically frees all the slaves. She acts like she's going to cooperate with the society that's there, but she ends up overthrowing that society in order to free the slaves. And you'd say, like, well, that's a good thing. And I do think it's a good thing. I think that was a good thing. But as the show goes on, she does all those things, and she gets it in her head as if she is the arbiter of right and wrong in all cases. And that ends up being her downfall, right? And so to push back against that, you need, as much as you need the myth that you can be a force for good, you also need the myth that you can still do wrong always. And you need to be, that always needs to be in counterbalance with that myth. Otherwise, you're going to end up with the Khaleesi figure. She does all these great things, and she believes she's great to the point where she destroys a whole city and sets people on fire. But to her, she was just trying to free the world. She was just trying to free the world of Cersei Lannister, who is this tyrant. She's in her position, her role in the universe is to rid the world of tyrants, even if it means killing innocent people, essentially. So it's really easy to get that narrative in your head too. The problem is that I think the problem is that up until that point where she did that, she was mostly doing really good things that everybody agreed were good things. So it's just like, don't tell me that you can't commit a good action just because everybody has different perspectives. I don't believe that. I think that's ridiculous. You're not going to convince me that, and I think the left gets confused sometimes because it's just like, well, then is a rapist right because it's their perspective? Like, no, you're never going to say that. You know it's wrong, right? And you know why it's wrong. Is it right to them? Sure, but that doesn't matter, right? Because their values are not humanistic.
Thankfully, we're not that relativistic,
right? Right.
But so this character that you're talking about, her main motive was the aspects of freeing people. There wasn't an.
Yep.
Okay, so.
Well, no. So that's not fully true. She does believe that she's the rightful heir to everything, because she comes from a long lineage of Targaryens, and she's the only one left. So to her, that throne's hers, you know. But then she ends up doing really bad things when she finally gets to it. Or she does really bad things to get it, which she doesn't see as bad, because to her, she's just ridding the world of tyrants, and she doesn't see herself as a tyrant. She sees herself as the doer of good deeds. And so, I think that ends up being a good dynamic to understand that narrative, and also how that narrative can go wrong. How, you know, we can do this with anything too. I think, like, you can look at World War II and you could say, well, ultimately America did the right thing. You know, weren't we the good guys there? But you can also look at history and say, well, it's not like we got into it for the right reasons at first. We knew some of the stuff that was going on. The government knew that some of the stuff that was going on, and we didn't necessarily jump in, right? So it's not necessarily that easy. We had to have selfish motivations to want to get involved. So I think that the narrative could be useful. I think we have to prepare for the narrative. I think we have preparation to do first. That's where I stand. I don't think we just want to jump into the narrative and say this is true, because if we do, we might oversee some very important flaws. We want to prepare ourselves to be a force for good in the world.
I don't think that myth is true any longer. Like I said, my concern is, how do you actualize it? And I think you do it the way that you're describing, you know, through self-reflection, preparation, and, you know, a form of transparency at the federal level when we're, you know, sending our soldiers to go march somewhere, you know, with Iraq. Well, I think we start losing the trail, from a military standpoint at Vietnam, and we get farther away from that myth as we get, to Iraq, and that war in particular, because the reasons that we were told we were going there were not the real reasons that we went, and so it causes the American population to ask questions about itself and wonder why we're fighting for the things that we're fighting for, and that's really when we start to lose our way and people start to lose their perception, and even though my conversation is focused towards the foreign policy of the United States, I mean, even internally, this idea that we're the good guys has changed because of the perception of certain classes of people not having the same freedoms as others.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfect starting point for thinking about what needs to happen, because I do, I'm not anti-capitalist, but I do think that capitalism incentivizes a lot of bad behavior, obviously. Iraq war just being one of them. And one thing that I try to get people to see who are very pro-capitalist, or let's say like unrelentingly capitalist, is that money isn't just a green piece of paper. It's not, and it can't be. But that's the way people want to treat it, when in reality it is power, like incarnate. And so the more power you give somebody, the more leverage they have to enact their will, good or bad. And that's not how you bring about good incentives. The reason that you can compel a whole nation to go to war, the funding that it takes to spread a false narrative, the money it takes to get us there, to lobby to get us there, was because of companies like Halliburton, right? That had so much power that they could do it, and there wasn't enough counterpower to prevent them from doing it. And so I think that some of the aspects of capitalism end up stifling that potentiality.
Well, even public will was popular.
Even what?
There was a public will for that war,
right?
And because I always try to distill things back to like the common person in our conversations, and I like to impress civic duty on people as individuals, because I think that's something that we're really missing, and I think that's one of the reasons why we do this podcast, is it's our sense of civic duty and contribution in some capacity. But the public will has to be there for a war to happen, which is like right now we're talking in the news is this idea about war with Iran, and I'm not concerned about it at the moment, because I don't think the public will would be there. I think people would be furious if we made tangible steps towards something like that to happen, because if you think Iraq was bad, I'm going to tell you that Iran's going to be quite a lot worse than that. And I think we're safe from that because the public will is no longer there. I mean, the public's figured out that these wars in the Middle East are not good for us, even though there are some justifiable aspects of what we do in the Middle East, if you go back to 9/11. But the public will is not there for that kind of war, and therefore it's not something I'm worried about.
Does that have anything to do with Trump's actions in terms of, didn't he just give weapons to
Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, Saudi Arabia, and he did it without Congress.
I heard about that. I don't know anything about it, so I can't.
Oh, okay.
I can't say much there. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that one.
Yeah. I think that the character of America and Americans is under question, and rightfully so. And that's the problem with the myth, is that there are a lot of Americans who don't have the best intentions for people.
Well, I think, are we asking those questions though because the myth exists? I mean, because we do have this perception that we are supposed to be
Yeah,
a
we do.
country that behaves in an altruistic way towards the rest of the world and towards ourselves.
I don't even think it's necessarily altruistic because the myth is that we are the good guys. I think so, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the good guy does what's selfish. Sometimes the good guy, that's gonna the narrative is going to be like, so. For instance, like we
Okay, so let me point this perspective out. If our even if our motivations are selfish, there are oftentimes mutual gain for the individuals that we, if we go to war in World War II, right? We were pretty isolationist during that war until we got attacked at Pearl Harbor, and that's when we were like, okay, we're doing this. We're committed to war in Europe and war in the East, but the result of our selfish action is that Japan is now a flourishing country. Germany is now a flourishing country. Europe was saved. Same thing with the Korean War. South Korea is now a free nation.
Mm-hmm.
In the Civil War, you get okay. A lot of people argue that the real reason that we fought that war is preservation of the Union. Fine, but those selfish interests benefited an entire race of people, whereas other countries who behave in selfish manners don't necessarily provide benefits to those outside of themselves when they take a selfish action. And I think that's one of the things that build into our myth is even when we do something selfish, the underlying
reason is for good.
Yes, or the result of which will hopefully be good. Like the idea in Iraq was that what we went to war there for was not necessarily true. I think we were misled, but the idea was that even if we do this, if things go the right way, now we'll have a flourishing democracy in the Middle East beyond Israel, which would have been a good thing, and we're not sure where that's going to go yet, but I guess that's what I'm driving at, is our myths create positive results even when we have selfish motivations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I don't think that there aren't times to be selfish too. I think sometimes being selfish is the right thing.
Yeah.
But the problem is that it just becomes too easy. If you tell yourself I think it goes back to that. If you tell yourself that the good guy, then it's always just easy to miss what you're bad at because you think you're the good guy.
Sure.
It is again, it's the Game of Thrones thing. She just really, and he's even talking to her. I think that's a really good moment because it allows me to be critical of kind of like both perspectives. Like one perspective is you can see how that could happen because John ends up asking her like, well, how do you know you're right? Or whatever. And she gives some circular argument. Her argument ends up being like, because I am right, essentially,
Mm-hmm.
because I know it, because I can tell right from wrong. That's what I think she ends up saying, right? And if you believe that in all cases, you're apt to make mistakes because you're not seeing yourself as a flawed human being that can make those mistakes. So
if we distill the conversation down even further from a nation like the United States to a person, and we're talking about
the same thing.
But if we're talking about a good guy or a good man, what qualities would that person possess? We might say self-reflective characteristics, the ability to listen to others when we're being told that we're wrong.
Right. And I think that's where the work comes in too.
Yeah, and those are things that our nation needs to do to actualize that myth. And I mean, alliances in the world are altering now because of our behavior the last few years as a country.
Yeah.
And those alliances may not necessarily be good for the traditional allies that we've had over the years. Like particularly in France, with like Marine Le Pen's party. It used to be called the National Front. I forget what they're called now, but countries are allying more with Russia, who's, if we're talking about self-interest. Theirs are more, at least from our perspective, seem to be more malevolent than, maybe the United States. But I wasn't sure where I was going to go with that. I just lost my trail of thought.
Yeah, I think that the United States can be a force for good. I just think we have a lot of work to do, which I think takes a level of nationalism. It takes a level of like, let's work on ourselves first before we start acting like we know what's right and wrong and going around. Yep. I don't think it's, and this is just where I diverge with liberals here. I don't think there's anything wrong with helping. I don't. And you'll never convince me that it is. I think that humanism and humanitarian efforts are good things, undeniably. I think that what happened in North Korea, or what is happening in North Korea, is atrocious. And ideally, those people should be free. They should be independent. They shouldn't be under the tyranny of a government that wants to control them, essentially. So ultimately, the good thing would be for somebody to step in. I don't think we're at all prepared to do anything like that at this point. I think it would take a lot of, again, self-reflection as both individuals and as a nation. So I don't know where we are in terms of the myth, and I don't know if it's useful to us. No, well, actually, like you were saying, like part of the myth is, well, what does the good person do? Well, the good person is self-reflective, right? So it is to maybe expand the myth or make it a more nuanced story, where it's not so much that we are the good guys, it's that we want to be. Mm-hmm. Like, that's the real helpful myth. Mm-hmm. The helpful myth is that we obviously want to be. We obviously want to do the right things, and then to have a conversation of what that is and what that looks like. And maybe to even pull back from calling yourself a good person ever and saying, I want to be a good person. I'm not a good person. I want to be, because that takes effort.
I think you're on the right track with that.
Yeah. That's a matter of effort at that point, and action, as opposed to, kissing your own ass all the time. And any nation can do it. I think nations should start banding together. I think they should, especially.
That doesn't sound very nationalistic.
Yeah. I think.
That's the European Union, right?
Yeah, it's the European
banding
Union
together.
Yeah, it's the UN as well to some degree, right? Yeah. I don't know what to use. I really don't know. And that's where I come to, and I think it's a place where we should all learn to come to personally. That's just my opinion, is that we need to get to a place where we know less. We get to a place where we try to know less. We try not to know as much. Like, I don't know if nation states would be useful in a better world, or if states would be, like, you have your nations, and then you have your states.
I want to give you a chance to clarify, because you said you want to get to a place where we know less, and I feel like you don't believe that.
No, we need, to me, I think we need to reduce the amount that we know. And I mean in terms of, let me clarify it this way. We need to reduce the amount that we claim to know. Like, we need to get to a place where the massiveness of the universe and the multiple perspectives that humans have humbles us to a place where we make less claims about the world. Mm-hmm. I think that is a good starting point.
So you'd rather us not make the claim that we're the good guys of the world?
Yeah, and that we know absolutely what it is in all circumstances, or even most circumstances, that um, that we are, even on a national level or even globally, we're so small, I guess, is the point, is that we're really small, and we need to feel that. We need to incorporate that in everything. That isn't, I don't think it means that sometimes you're like, no, I know it's right. You know, they just had a KKK rally, right? I don't know if you heard about that at all,
Yeah.
right? And there's a lot of counter protests, and it's just like, I'm not ever going to be convinced that it was the wrong thing to counter protest.
Yeah.
You know, like that. That's horrible. That perspective, or whatever. I never want to get to the point where I reduce it to, well, the universe is so big and I'm so small, so I can't say they're wrong. You know, sometimes you have to take a stand. But to me, all that boils down to the argument anyway. I guess that's just where I stand on it. To me, the reason that they're wrong is because the arguments that they're producing are shit. The arguments that they're producing aren't good. And I guess, I don't know. I don't really know. You know, I guess that's the...
So I think I like the track that you were on where you rephrased the myth to, you know, we want to get to the point that we want to be the good guys, rather than we are, because that's a strong statement, and that says that you have, when you say I am the good guy or we are the good guys, that says that there isn't much left to work on. Whereas when you say we are the good guys, it means there is still more to work on and do. But if you're trying to get your society to actualize that myth, I mean, going back again to, there has to be a sense of the individual and their responsibilities to their civic duties to put politicians and political leadership into positions that are going to fulfill that and actualize that myth. And then those individuals in policy related positions or political positions, military positions, humanitarian, you know, whatever role you play in the government, you have to be thinking about actualizing that idea and what your role is in that. And when we get individuals into power who are motivated by their interests alone and not how their actions impact our country or our country's identity, that's when we can stray from those ideas. You know, if you have someone in political power, you know, again, going back to the Iraq War, it's like, you know, I can make a lot of profit off of war with my organization. You know, that selfish motivation is going to contribute to, you know, a large amount of the population asking, you know, who we are as a country because you were selfish.
Actually, that's making me, okay, I think I'm gathering some of the things here now. So one thing is that it's possible that the people who engaged in the Iraq War or kind of steered America consciously in the direction to get us involved in that war saw it as, I need to make some money, right? Another possibility is that they genuinely believed that the Iraqi government was corrupt. And so they can kind of play this game where I know I'm benefiting from it, but if you benefit and you do the right thing at the same time, you know, who really cares, right?
Yeah.
Like you can get into that mindset really easily. This goes to, I was reading Job the other night. And
The Book of Job?
Yeah, the Book of Job.
Now I'm interested.
Yeah, I was reading the Book of Job the other night, and it put a lot of things into perspective for me. Like a lot of different things.
Let's have this conversation.
Yeah, and I heard Slavoj Žižek talking about Job. I don't necessarily agree with his interpretation, but his interpretation is interesting because his view is that essentially all these bad things are happening to Job. And his friends are like rationalizing it. They're like, well, you didn't pray enough. You didn't do this. You need to do this, blah, blah, blah. And by the end, God comes and he's just like, all that's shit. Like everything your friends are saying, they're misleading you, and you're misleading yourself because you're rationalizing all this, essentially. So Slavoy's interpretation is that God's answer to Job is that there is no reason. There's no reason. It happens. It happens to good people and it happens to bad people. It just happens because God is bigger than all that. And so God, what's the word? God pales all of our actions and motives. He pales, or she, or
it goes
it.
back to what you were saying about us being small.
Yes, pales everything that we do, right? Even our morality, even our claims to do what's good. Because Job keeps saying, like, I'm a righteous man. Why is this happening to me? I'm righteous. I'm good in the eyes of the Lord. And the Bible even says that. The Bible says that Job was like a good representation of a believer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why God seemed to favor him in the first part. I'm not saying there's not contradictions, because there are to me when I see them. But one of the things that he makes, the claims that he makes, is morality. And if somebody comes right before God too, but God kind of like reinforces this idea as well, where they're like, what is your good work in comparison to a perfect being? Like, what good work, like, what do you think you do that is so great in comparison to absolute perfection, right? And I think that encapsulates what I was saying earlier, which is that, like, the humility is what's needed. So it's just like, what do I do? If every deed that I do might be absolute shit, what could I possibly act in? And I think that the purpose is to act and stop expecting.
Okay, well, I'll take this from one direction, because I could actually talk about the Book of Job for a long time and the philosophical implications of it. I'm trying not to go down that path because that's not what this podcast is about. But I think you're on the right track with the sense that the American pride is like Americans have a huge ego, and I think it's because of our myths, right? We've done so much good for the world. And it is something to be proud of, right? To be part of that culture and history. For me, like, a sense of pride is that, both my grandfathers fought in World War II, right? It's like a legacy that I want to figure out how to uphold in my own life by my own ways of service. But American pride can lead us to some scary decisions that we make. And so I think you're right in the sense that we have to be more humble, maybe as a nation, and less prideful, and that might help us make better domestic policy decisions and foreign policy decisions.
Yeah, and even as individuals, I think that's where it starts. I think that individuals need to. It's not that it's so, like, my reason for reading Job was just like, I feel like I'm a good person, right? And I say that all, in my head all the time. I feel like I do things that I'm supposed to, so on and so forth. I feel like I struggle really hard to get ahead in life and to make things happen, and they don't manifest.
Do you feel like you've earned cosmic punishment between the devil and God?
No.
Because that's what happened to Job.
Yeah, I know.
Job's punishment or torments in life was from a deal between the devil and God.
Right.
And that's where I find that's the injustice to me. Job being so small would be like, you're so great and you have time to crush my life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the thing about that though is that and I agree with you. That's why, I don't take the Bible wholly seriously. I think it added that reading Job for me added to my life, right? So certainly texts can add to your life, but you can't take them as absolute. So that's just one of those things where it's just like, well, a human wrote it, So to me, what I get from that story isn't this conscious being that is torturing us and not torturing us. It goes back to, again, my ideas of God, which is not necessarily a conscious being. Mm-hmm. So the fact that there is something bigger than you that dwarfs everything that you do and say. That's just that's the reality. We don't even need to argue about that, right? And then you go on, and you're just like, so you read these people who are giving him explanations, right? Which God eventually dismisses, or he says that's all ridiculous. But it's just like, where did they get the idea that any of the stuff that they were saying was true? Well, they got it from stuff that's in the Bible.
Yeah, they got it from God.
Yeah, they're saying the same stuff that was said earlier in the Bible.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And there's another issue there, right? There's another issue there. But that, to me, none of that is important. What's important is just the realization that somebody figured out a long time ago when one person or multiple people were writing the book of Job, that unfair things happen regardless of how good you are or what your intentions are. Like bad things happen. It's just like, what do you do in that?
Well, we need to make a correction. We need to make a correction about.
It'll come back on. Yeah.
Okay. The Book of Job is actually one of the oldest books in the Bible. So the characters in the story probably were not getting their arguments from the Bible.
Right. No, that's not what I said though.
Okay.
Yeah. I said I was talking about the culture. Like they got it from
they got it from that culture.
They got it from things that were said earlier in the Bible. If you read the Bible chronologically, right? But they did. I know that the Bible wasn't formed at that point, but they did get it from cultural aspects that were eventually codified.
Yes.
Essentially.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
I just want to clarify because I knew someone, if they were listening, was going to be like, no,
the Bible wasn't around. Yeah. No, that's not what I'm saying. Right, but they did get it from a culture that ended up being written in the Bible or solidified in the Bible.
Yes. Yeah.
And we understood, like, oh, they got it from the cultural stories that they were telling, right? Which the Bible glorifies. They were giving you all the answers that the Bible also gives you for things. That's where they got those ideas, right? So it can be really confusing if you believe it wholly to be true, and you're sitting there and you're like, wait a second, like what they're saying isn't. That actually, I remember that. I remember when I first started to read the Book of Job and they said those things, I was like, that sounds right. And it confused me by the time I got to God, and he was like, no. But I really think what it is it's, again, I think God is everywhere. And so we have all these narratives, and someone figured out a long time ago, you can come up with every rationalization in the world as to why your life is the way it is. But that's all it is your explanation, and you don't really know, and you need to understand that. And then what you do at that point is you stop thinking about it so much. You stop giving it so much. You stop giving those narratives so much power in your life, and you become kind of more free in a way. You become liberated by all the stories that you can tell yourself as to why your life sucks or doesn't suck, or the fact that your actions are good. So why did a bad thing come from your actions? Like you can vote for Hillary, and then Hillary does awful things. She becomes president and does awful things, right? And then you're just like, I was doing the right thing, so there's no more thinking.
Sorry, go ahead.
There's no more thinking that needs to be done, as opposed to, no, I can commit an action thinking I'm doing the right thing and be absolutely wrong, because this universe is huge and there are multiple perspectives and it's nuanced. So,
well, in thinking about the United States and being a United States citizen, we're talking about power, and we're talking about you're talking about like being small in the universe. But the things that we've talked about in the podcast before is that as you increase in your influence and power, you increase in your responsibility to those in your society and those around you, right? So as an American citizen and as a country, as the United States, we have a greater responsibility, again, returning to this idea of the myth, to actualize that myth for others in the world, because we have that power and because we have that influence and the ability. Yeah. We are a large nation. We are godlike in comparison to other countries in this world, and not because. And when I say godlike, I don't mean in superiority as individuals. I mean in power and influence that we have. Right. And so, inevitably, you're going to use that power and influence, right? So we have an obligation to, like, in the story of Job. Do you think that was a useful use of power? Like, from we're talking about the Christian worldview,
Mm-hmm.
and from a philosophical perspective, I don't think that's an appropriate use of power by God.
Yeah.
Again, and and I'm not God, and I understand that if there is a God out there, they can do whatever they choose. But from the morality that I got from the Bible growing up, that story always jarred me because it didn't seem
fair
or just.
Yeah.
And when we carry out our decisions as a country, we don't want to treat any person like Job when we make decisions that we make. When we go to Iraq, I keep using Iraq because it's a good modern example. We had an obligation to get that right when we went in there, regardless of our initial motivations. We had an obligation as a country to ensure that it remained stable, and organizations like ISIS couldn't move in and destroy so many things that people fought and died for, and so many Iraqi, not just Americans or British or other European allies that went to fight there, but the Iraqi population themselves. We had an obligation to get that right, because of our influence and power, and we didn't do that, and that diminishes these ideas that we have about ourselves, about trying to be a good or great nation.
Yeah, so I think the response to this is going to be, and I think it's something we should think about, something I just thought about, is the argument against that, or the what people are going to pose against that, which they might have a point about, is that the problem is playing God in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That the problem is pretending like you know what's right in all circumstances, and that's good enough to do the right thing, when it's not, when you're such an ignorant. So the problem is that we have all this power, so we must know and do what's right, as opposed to recognizing, like, I'm still really small. It doesn't matter how much power I accumulate in the nuance of the universe. It's not that much. It's really not. And I need to let that be at the forefront of my brain when I'm making decisions. We had an obligation, because you were saying, like, one, you were saying that we're godlike. And so we have this idea that, that when you, I'm not going to say we shouldn't intervene, because I think that we should, but I just think it's all about the attitude that you have.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I don't think, and as kind of strange as it sounds, I think maybe as strange as it sounds, is it's the issue is the perspective that, that you're going to do what's right. That's not exactly right, but it's something like that.
If we took a step back from the international stage, creates a power vacuum, who do you think fulfills that role?
Okay.
In the world's influencer.
I think people already are. I think China's doing that.
Do you think that's better for the world?
I don't know.
Okay. That's what I'm driving at, is that there's the philosophical implications of this myth.
Mm-hmm.
There's real world impact to the idea of how we see ourselves, and if we live up to that or not. So if we decide that, you know what, we're not, we shouldn't be the good guys, we shouldn't play this role on the international stage, we'll take a step back.
Yeah.
I think my argument would be that more malevolent characters will take over that role, because I don't think that Europe is going to do that.
Yeah.
As a collective, they don't have the power because they're operating as little pieces to one thing, whereas countries like China or Russia, they have the ability to move at a faster pace, because there's so few people in control of that. That they can make quick decisions in the world stage. My concern is leaving that power vacuum there. I think we play an important part in the world, and I don't think that we should engineer everything that happens, but we keep introducing these cosmic elements of us being small, and that there's this vastness to the universe. Well, we're in a place in history where the people who end up controlling the world now are going to drive how the world shapes, because this is a global society now. Mm-hmm. So who do you want to shape that global society? You want someone who is invested in positive ideas like freedom and justice. And even though we don't have everything right in the United States, I think we're closer than other actors in the world to have the ability to manipulate how global society ultimately shakes out, which is why I press for us to actualize this myth.
Right.
Because the way that we behave now, 200, 300, 400 years down the road, is going to help shape what human society on a global scale actually looks like. So do you want a totalitarian type society for the entire globe, or do you want a more democratic and free society?
I wonder if the answer is, that's stupid for me to say, but because I don't know. I just don't know. More and more I come to that conclusion more than anything, and I'm happy with that.
Yeah.
I think that's the right thing. But I wonder if potentially the answer is the same thing with the individual answer, which is that it's kind of like the lead by example or whatever.
Yep.
That if you do the right things, ultimately I think that two kind of beliefs that I have is that ultimately people want what's true and they want what's good. Like, I believe that. Even though they end up obviously not knowing what's true and not doing what's good. I think that's a desire that seems to infiltrate almost everybody. And so if you are the type of person who starts to look like you do have truth and that you are doing what's good, that's going to have more power in actually shaping and changing things than constantly intervening on everything. But that doesn't mean there's not reasons for intervention either, because I'm trying to think of this like, you don't if you know your next door neighbor's a rapist, right, and he's got children or she's got children locked up in the basement, your response isn't, well, I'm just gonna not be a rapist and live my life and hope that person changes their mind.
Yeah.
At some level, intervention has to happen if you have the power to stop it. So I don't want to say not to do that, but maybe we need to incorporate more of the mindset of, and again, this goes back to nationalism or individuality. Like, I'm going to live my life in such a way, or I want to get a nation that conducts itself a certain way, and stop worrying so much about other nations. Obviously, we care about them. Right.
And what I'm saying is what I'm trying to drive out in this whole podcast, maybe I'm not doing it well, is that those myths help to drive those individual behaviors.
Right.
I mean, it's helped that myth. I mean, if you think about the things that I've done in my life, those myths have shaped careers I've chosen,
right,
jobs that I've done, places I've traveled.
Yeah.
Because I bought into that myth, regardless of the truth of it or not. But it's been useful for me to buy into that myth being true. And so if we live like it's true, it creates a certain civic society and character of individuals. Yeah. Which is what I want. Yeah. But if we behave in a way that it's no longer believable, you lose that. And that's what I think the danger is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. I agree with you, I guess. My adopted attitude, and I don't know what's good for other people or what would work on a national scale, but it could, is just to know less. So kind of be less willing to make certain claims, to really try to limit the amount of claims that you make. And to recognize that a lot of morality is a matter of perspective. That doesn't mean there's not right or wrong, but that kind of your own. Never be surprised if you thought you did the right thing and the bad thing happened. Never let that catch you off guard, because ultimately you don't know. Mm-hmm. And to kind of walk in that narrative, so maybe ultimately it is about God or whatever. Just kind of kind of recognizing how ignorant you are. Because what's the counter narrative now, right? The myth is that we know what's true and we know what's good, right? As opposed to, I want to know what's true and I want to know what's good. That doesn't mean that I do. And every step I take needs to be in that myth. That myth that needs to be a part of the narrative that I'm walking in, right? So now I'm going to Iraq, and instead of saying, I know what's good, it's, what's the right thing here? And to really just kind of let that overburden you. Not burden. I mean, because I don't think it should be anxiety producing. I think there should be a freedom in it. Like, oh, I don't know what's good, right? So I'm not obligated to have definitive answers. I'm going to act, and I'm going to take a step back and look at what happened and kind of adjust, because I can't be an ultimate arbiter of good or bad or true or false. I can't do those things. I can only act right now with the amount of knowledge that I have right now, which is going to change in the future, and the set of moralities I have right now, which are hopefully going to change in the future. So, and just to never be surprised at what happens. The universe is way bigger than you, so you don't know. I feel like if we had had that attitude, the Iraq War wouldn't have happened the way that it did, because we didn't see all the, to us, we're going as liberators. Oh, well, we've actually destabilized everything, and now there are all these factions that we didn't see happening, right? It is that narrative that we knew what was good that drove us into that, as opposed to, had we been like, I don't know what's good, and then you start to see, well, what could actually happen here? Then you start to ask those questions. Those questions don't come up if you think you're just doing the right thing.
Yeah, that's a great point, man.
So I think that's what I want to do. Like, most of my mental energy now is just trying to stay at a state of peace internally. I feel like that's what everybody should do, and I feel like that's ultimately what would bring about a nation that could actually do good in the world. Is to the point where people are just trying to get to a place of internal peace and humbleness, not happiness, not these other things, but just a matter of, the universe is big. The universe is big. What's happening over there, obviously we don't want it to happen. But that happens in the universe sometimes, where good people have awful things happen to them. Moral people have awful things happening to them, or their actions bring about negative consequences. And that's the universe we live in. And I think that results in more calculated steps and more kind of strident, peaceful steps. If that makes any sense. I feel like it makes some sense, but
it makes sense to me.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have anything else that you want to say. I think that's a good stopping point to just let people kind of wrestle with this idea too. Because that's what I really want to do, is have some thought experimentation on this myth. Because
there's something missing here, but I can't put my finger on it.
Well, maybe we could do a part 2 down the road if we keep sorting through it. But I think it's a good place for people to stop and think about it, because I think this idea is worth wrestling with. And worth trying to sort out. So, I don't know, is there any closing things that you want to say?
The closing things I want to say are, or I guess maybe some things to think about, like endpoints to also think about, would be ultimately, I don't know myself. And I think we should adopt that attitude a lot more, and kind of be more willing to listen and to observe, as opposed to talk and intervene. I think we should spend a lot more time sitting back and watching or listening, and a lot less time because then you don't have to make claims, and a lot less time. A lot less time talking and making assertions, and what was the other side of that? Yeah, and feeling like we have to intervene in everything, essentially, because we know what's best, essentially.
All right. Well, I appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to us. Do the whole, if you want to comment on what we have to say, particularly this episode, I'd be really interested, because I've actually given aspects of this talk at museums before, and I didn't get the responses that I thought that I would get. So I'm always interested in hearing what people have to say about this idea of the American myth, or different myths that the United States might have, that are either useful or detrimental to us. So get a hold of us. We're easy to get a hold of. Check out our other episodes. Let us know what you think. We're always looking for feedback. And
if you like what we're doing, we want more of these things to happen. So, if you don't, then don't do anything. If you do, then do something about it. If you're like, I feel like that was a balanced conversation, or you see value in conversations like these, the more feedback we get, the more time we're going to invest. The more resources we have, the more time we're going to invest. So, it's ultimately not up to us. It's up to you guys, and recognize your role and responsibility in that.
Cool. Yep. This is Currency Discourse podcast, and hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Take it easy.